Welcome to another edition of Ask Claire along the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. My name is Claire Hall. I'm your host, and as you know, if you've been listening these past several months,
is a Comfortably
I get to
Zoned
talk
Radio
with
Network
all
production.
kinds of interesting people on all kinds of interesting subjects. But, of course, I keep returning again and again to my favorite subject, baseball, and some great baseball authors. I've had some other fine baseball authors on the program, but I don't think I've had one on the program until now I would say as prolific and successful as the man we're talking to today, the author of 10, count them, 10 New York Times bestsellers, Peter Golenbock. Welcome. Good morning.
Well, thank you so much.
Glad to have you here, and I say good morning because it is morning when we're talking, but, one of the beauties of Internet radio podcasts is people can listen anytime they like. So anyway, glad to get it started, and I should also add that Peter is author of more than one of really my favorite books, and let's start off with your very first book, Dynasty, about the Casey Stengel era of the Yankees, and I think it's an interesting story in itself, just how you came to write that. Tell us about your background and how and why you came to write Dynasty.
Well, it's remarkable that I had the opportunity to do it. I had graduated from NYU Law School, and I got a job working for a law firm in New York City called Friedman and Fishman. And I was working there about 6 weeks. They asked me to look at a bunch of files, and I looked at them, and the statute of limitations had run on 6 of them. And I went and I told Mr. Friedman, the statute's run. What are we going to do? And he says, I'll call these people up on the phone, tell them why they don't have a case. And I said, I quit. And that was it. That was my entire legal career right there.
Wow.
So I went to work for Prentice Hall, and they hired me as the editor of Wage and Price Controls. This was President Nixon in the summer of 1972. He had instituted Wage and Price Controls. And I was there and discovered that the prices for the corporations were allowed to rise, but the wages weren't. And it seemed something of a scam on the working people. And after 6 weeks, I guess that's about my term. After 6 weeks, I had been a huge fan of a book by the name of The Yankees by Frank Graham.
Oh, yes.
He wrote about Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig and Joe DiMaggio, and I must have read that book 20 times. And I was just a huge fan of it, and it was published in 1946. So I thought to myself, well, you grew up with the Yankees. I had rooted for the Yankees all those years in the 50s and 60s when they won pennant after pennant after pennant. And I thought, why don't I write the sequel to Frank Graham's Yankees? And so I walked down to the head of the trade book division. His name was Nick Dincheco. And I was very, very fortunate because Nick Dincheco was as big a Yankee fan as I was. Because if he had been a Red Sox fan or a San Francisco Giants fan or a Kansas City fan, he would have looked at me and said, what makes you think you can even write a book? But, I told him what I wanted to do, and he gave me a contract to write this book on the Yankees. So I contacted. Yeah.
So you had no background, no published background at all in journalism or anything.
Right. I had been the sports editor. I'd been the sports editor at the Dartmouth, and I had written sports articles for the New York Times and the Boston Globe while I was at Dartmouth.
Okay.
So I had done a little bit, but
okay, you had a few clips. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. But so now you got the contract in hand, and what happens?
Okay. So I go over to Yankee Stadium. I call up the Yankees, and I said, I had said to him, if I can get a contract to do this, will you let me do my research at Yankee Stadium? And Marty Appel, who was the assistant PR guy, he said, I can't imagine that you're going to get a contract, but if you do get a contract, by all means, you can come and do it. So I got the contract. I went over to the Yankees, and I spent August, September, October, November, December, January, February, researching what they had in their very, very large library of newspaper clippings. Meanwhile, during this whole time, it was the Mike Burke Yankees when I started, and in January of 1973, it became the George Steinbrenner Yankees. And so I actually had a front row seat watching Steinbrenner take over from Mike Burke, and one by one, picking off each one of Mike Burke's people and having them, pushing them basically to quit because Steinbrenner was so horrible. And, slowly having Steinbrenner's people take over those jobs. It was very, very interesting to watch. But the thing was that after doing all this research with pages and pages of notes that I took, I then sat down to write this book, never having written a book before, and I discovered I didn't really know anything more than what we read in the newspapers. Mm-hmm. So I went back to Nick Dincheco and said, look, in order to write this book, I need to go around the country and interview all these Yankees, and I need another $2,500. Uh-huh. And he gave it to me. Oh, wow. So I started with Jim Constanti, because his home was, an hour from Cooperstown, where I did some more research. I started with Constanti, and I started interviewing players. And before I was done, Dincheco had given me two more $2,500 checks for a total of $10,000, and I had traveled 33,000 miles by car, by plane, visiting all the Yankees who had played from 1947 to 1964.
What was that like?
It was
getting to meet
glorious.
These guys.
It was absolutely glorious. It was so much fun. It was fun, of course, to go around the country and to go to Oklahoma City, to go to Los Angeles, to go to San Francisco, Whitey Ford was in New York. He was in Long Island, and I was living at the Roger Williams Hotel at the time. And Whitey was such a decent guy. He said, I've got this dinner that I have to go to tonight. I'll come to your place. So Whitey came to my pitchy little hotel room, and I interviewed him for 2 hours during the afternoon, and he was marvelous. Wow. Billy Martin was the manager of Texas at the time, and so I caught him in spring training where the Texas Rangers were training, and I can't actually remember where that was at the time. But we sat in the stands, and I interviewed him for a couple hours, and that turned out to be the thing that really changed my life, actually. I'll tell you about that in a minute.
Okay.
And Mickey Mantle said, come to my home in Dallas, and I'll talk to you there. So I flew to Dallas, and I called Mickey's telephone number, and his wife answered and said, Mickey's in New York. Mickey's going to be at the stadium tomorrow. So it's like, okay. So I caught the next plane back to New York, and the next morning went to Yankee Stadium, where they were having some sort of, I don't remember whether it was Old Timers Day or something else, but I walked into the Yankee clubhouse, and there was Mickey, and he knew I was coming. But I was so awed by him. I mean, he was everything to me. And I had interviewed Elston Howard, and so I said, Ellie was a coach, and so I said, Ellie, would you do me a favor? Would you walk me over to Mickey and introduce me? And so he did that. And I said, Mickey, can I talk to you for a few minutes? And Mickey, who's just, what a character, looks me in the eye and he goes, no. And you could see my whole mouth just fall. And then he started laughing. He started laughing. He said, okay, sure, absolutely right. And we had the most marvelous conversation there in the clubhouse for more than an hour, where he was telling me the nightmares he was having. He'd retired after the '68 season This was 1973. So he had been out of it 5 years, and he was telling me that at night that he would be sleeping and he would have these dreams that the PA announcer would be saying, now batting in the third position, number 7, Mickey Mantle. And Mickey would be outside Yankee Stadium, unable to find the door to get in.
Wow, I remember that, and I remember thinking, wow, what an insight into what drove and haunted that man.
Yeah. It was really, really something. And he was telling me, in the 1951 World Series, he was in right field and Joe DiMaggio was in center, and somebody had hit a fly ball between them, and Mickey went over for it and stepped on a grate from the watering system and really screwed up his knee, something fierce, so that he wasn't able to play anymore during that season. And Mickey was telling me that he was on the way to the hospital, and his father was there. His father, Mutt, from Commerce, Oklahoma, came to the 51 World Series to watch him play. And so Mutt was in the car with Mickey, and so that Mickey could, limp out of the car, Mickey put all his weight on Mutt's shoulder. And Mickey put his weight on my shoulder to show me how he did it. And I would have thought that a locomotive was leaning on my shoulder. That's how strong this guy was.
Wow.
And he was telling me that at that point, Mutt Mantle collapsed to the ground. Because what Mickey didn't know was that Mutt had cancer and was dying from cancer.
Yeah.
And so both of them ended up in the hospital at that time. It was a remarkable interview that we had. And it was just so interesting. I went to Atlanta to interview Clete Boyer. I had tried several times to get in touch with Roger Maris, who lived in Gainesville, Florida at the time. And I'd sent him, telegrams and wrote him letters, and even called the brewery where Roger and his brother had a brewery in Gainesville and got no answers. So at any rate, I called Clete on the phone. The Yankees were so wonderful. They gave me addresses and telephone numbers of all these players. This is something that just doesn't happen.
Exactly.
But Mike Burke was such a lovely man, and his people were just wonderful people, and they were thrilled that I was there to do this, as opposed to, a lot of other teams, like the Mets, for instance. When I wanted to do my book on the Mets, Jay Horowitz, looked at me like, no, I'm not going to help you. No, I won't do that. So I had to do it on my own. But with the Yankees, it was marvelous because they were so helpful. And so I'm in Atlanta. I call Clete on the phone, and Clete says, I will meet you tomorrow morning at my bar. He had this redneck bar outside of Atlanta. I'll meet you at 9 o'clock in the morning.
Okay.
And so I get there at 9 o'clock, and there are these giant former high school football players sitting around the bar drinking beer at 9 o'clock in the morning. And I'm sitting there with my cup of coffee, waiting for Clete. And it's 10 o'clock, and it's noon, and it's 3 in the afternoon, and it's 6 o'clock at night, no Clete. But what are you going to do? So I figured I'll sit here till eternity if I have to.
Well, sure.
And at about 8:45, Clete showed up with Roger Maris.
Oh, my God.
Oh, my God, was my reaction as well.
Uh-huh.
And so Clete, I shake hands with the two of them, and we go over to a table. The music is playing, and it's really, really loud. And Clete says, excuse me, guys, I've got to go take care of some business. So I'm sitting at this table with Roger Maris, and we're looking at each other, and the time is passing because, what in the world can you say? I didn't want to say to Roger, can we go outside and have a conversation? Because if he said no, that would have, totally wrecked, the evening. Yeah. And so we're sitting and making very small talk when Roger said to me, why don't we go outside and talk?
Oh, wow.
Which I thought, isn't that fabulous? And I sat on the hood of some car out in the parking lot, and Roger talked to me for an hour and a half about his career with the Yankees. And it was really the last interview he gave before he died.
Oh my God!
And it was just an absolutely spectacular, open interview where obviously he talked about what happened when he hit the 61 home runs and how every day he would go into the clubhouse and some reporter would say, "Do you think you can break Babe Ruth's record?" Until by, the middle of July, he was so sick of the question, he really became to really resent all of the writers who were really, on him. And on the other hand, the guy was about to break Babe Ruth's record. So what did you expect the reporters to do?
Yeah,
Roger,
yeah. It's
big
news.
But Roger was a very
country.
Yeah. He was a very reticent guy. He wasn't interested in publicity. Basically, he wanted to show up at the ball game, play the game, and go home. He wasn't interested in the ancillary things that went with it all. And he had no patience by the end of the 61 season for any of it. And, he was getting, bad reviews for his not being very nice to these writers.
Oh,
and
yeah.
so, 1962 rolls around. He hits the 61 home runs to break Babe Ruth's record. And a lot of the older reporters who were fans of Ruth sort of resented him for doing it. You can start with that. And people like Rogers Hornsby, badmouthed the guy during spring training. And so he just wasn't feeling very good about things. And then came the 1966 season.
Oh.
Mickey was hurt, and Roger was sort of carrying the Yankees on his back in terms of getting people to come to the ballpark. And during one of the games in the middle of the season, he slides home and catches his hand, I believe, on the umpire's cleats and breaks his hand. So Ralph Houck, who's the general manager, sends him to the doctor to get his hand x-rayed. And the Yankees don't tell him the results of the x-rays. They tell him his hand is fine, when in reality he had a broken hand. So that year he hit about, 233, something like that.
Yep.
Hit very few home runs, and the fans are booing him.
Well, sure.
And he's not very happy. And so he goes to Houck, and he says, "Look, I want to retire. I want to retire." And Houck says to him, "Look, do me a favor. Don't retire. Don't say anything. And come the spring, we'll have this great ceremony for you, and you can retire in the spring." And Roger's telling me this, and he says, and 3 weeks later, Ralph Houck traded me to the St. Louis Cardinals.
Which turned out to be a blessing for Roger in the long run, but wow.
It turned out to be a blessing for Roger and the Cardinals, as it turned out, because Roger helped lead the Cardinals in 67 and in 68 to World Series appearances.
But how that must have felt coming out of left field, so to speak.
Well, as he's talking to me about it, he's a very quiet guy, very unemotional guy.
Yep.
And he's saying, you just have no idea how much that hurt me. And now I couldn't retire because people are going to say, that bad old Roger, they trade him to the Cardinals and now he quits. So he didn't quit.
Yeah, and really, didn't he say, I'm sorry, those were like his two happiest years in the major leagues?
I'm sure they were. I'm absolutely sure they were his two happiest years because he didn't have all that New York City pressure.
Yeah.
I mean, the Cardinal fans love their Cardinals win or lose. The Yankee fans don't do that. They love their Yankees win or win. So there's a huge difference. And it was just so wonderfully interesting listening to Roger talk about that. And after he was finished, I had the opportunity to interview Cleat about his career with the Yankees. And Cleat was, a wonderfully, talkative guy as well. And, I interviewed people like, Joe Pepitone and Jim Bouton. I lived in Englewood, New Jersey at the time, and Jim Bouton lived about 3 streets over. And we became like brothers. We were very, very close. And we did things together. We played on the CBS All-Star team together. I babysat for his 3 kids. I was part of their family for 4 or 5 years, which was really a lot of fun. And
that's great.
Yeah, no, it was great. And Dynasty became a big hit. You can still buy it today, all those years later. That was 1975. So what is it? 2019. It's 45 years later. You can still buy Dynasty and read it.
Well,
and people do.
Yeah. Yes, and they should. It's a fabulous book. It's one of my favorite baseball books, and I think for younger people, they may, who are younger fans who are growing up in kind of this golden era of baseball books, that a baseball book in the mid-'70s was probably a much tougher sell than it is today, that there wasn't this wonderful stream of reportage on baseball and great works of baseball history like there is now. So
I had about a half a dozen. There were about a half a dozen books which became my Bibles as I was growing up. The Glory of Their Times by Larry Ritter came out in 1970. And I cherished that book the way religious people cherish the Bible. I teach a course. I teach a course on baseball here at the University of South Florida, St. Petersburg, and I make them read The Glory of Their Times, because these are the ball players who played in the 1900s and 1910s and 1920s, who give first-person accounts of what it was like. And it was just terrific. And so that book was part of how I did Dynasty. I had that. And of course, Ball 4 by Jim Bouton. That came out around the same time, and that was like a bombshell hit the world. This is the first baseball player who ever told people what baseball was really like, and that's a book also that you can still buy today.
Yep.
And
classics.
Yeah. Oh yeah. And the wonderful relief pitcher for the Chicago Cubs and the St. Louis Cardinals. Come on.
We're not thinking Bruce Sutter, are we?
No, way before him. He wore glasses. He wore glasses, and I interviewed
Jim Brosnan.
Jim Brosnan, thank you.
The long
Jim
season.
Jim Brosnan, who I interviewed for my Wrigleyville Cubs book. Jim Brosnan wrote two fabulous, not controversial books, but they were very, very interesting looks at what it was like to be a professional baseball player. So I had those books, in my head when I was writing Dynasty, and they were a big help.
Well, I think I picked up Dynasty within a year or two after it came out, and, they say to an aspiring writer, you need to get people with a strong hook. And just let me tell you what I brought to the reading of Dynasty and how you really pulled me in from the very first paragraph that, I'm 60, so I'm too young to remember the Casey Stengel era.
That's right.
But yet I was really an early student of baseball history, and, I knew the teams. I knew that amazing streak of dominance. I knew that Casey Stengel had been regarded as something of a clown and a failure when he managed in Brooklyn and the Boston Braves.
That's right.
But yet somehow I had it in my mind that, Casey comes to the Yankees, and there's this immediate aura of invincibility, and you open up the book by putting us at that press conference in 1948 where Casey is announced as the new manager of the Yankees.
That's right. Yep.
And at age 58, that was considered old back then. And
that's right.
He's nervous, and he's replaced, Bucky Harris. And a lot of people are saying, what the hell are Dan Topping and Del Webb thinking? Putting this guy in charge.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, wow, this, and you just pulled me right along. And it is a fabulous, fabulous book.
Thank you.
So you mentioned earlier in the program Billy Martin and your conversation with Billy for the research of Dynasty and how that turned out to be a life changer. Do you want to pick up on that?
I'd be happy to. And so after I wrote Dynasty, I then went to work for the Bergen Record. And I was going to spend the rest of my life being a reporter, or more probably an editor.
Mm-hmm.
And I started at the Record covering various towns. And after about 6 or 7 months, I went to the copy desk, where I spent a fabulous year. The only problem with the copy desk was it started at 10 o'clock at night, and your day was over at 6 o'clock in the morning. And that was a little rough. You know, it turned your life upside down. But the work just was fantastic. We wrote headlines. We corrected copy. We wrote picture cut lines. We did all of that. And then you really learn the business when you're on the copy desk. And then I went from there to being the assistant night news editor, where I was editing the feature stories that were on the front page of the second section of the Bergen Record. We were quite a newspaper back then, and I just enjoyed it so much. I really can't tell you. And then I got a call. From Billy Martin's agent. Apparently in Dynasty, I had said that Billy was as important to the Yankees as Mickey Mantle and Whitey Ford. Nobody had ever said that about him before.
Oh, wow.
So if you're going to pick somebody to write your autobiography, you might as well pick that guy.
Sure.
And so he picked me. Would I write Billy's book? Well, heck yes. So I got a call back a little while later. Billy can't do it right now, but I have one other client. And his name is Sparky Lyle. Would you like to write Sparky's book? Okay, so I said to myself, yeah, the guy's a relief pitcher for the Yankees. Why would anybody want to read a book about a relief pitcher? So the agent, who didn't want to miss out on his 15%, said to me very logically, come down to Fort Lauderdale and meet with Sparky and sit in the clubhouse and see what you can see, and maybe, something will come to you. And that's exactly what I did. I flew down to Fort Lauderdale, and I'm sitting in the clubhouse, and I'm sitting there with Thurman Munson, I'm sitting with Greg Nettles, I'm sitting with Reggie Jackson and Billy Martin, and I know George Steinbrenner's hovering above somewhere. And I thought to myself, remembering Ball 4, remembering Jim Brosnan's 2 books, I said to Sparky, if you will keep a diary with me, I think we really got something here. And Sparky, being the good sport that he was, said yes. So I was living in Englewood, New Jersey, and Sparky was living in Demarest, New Jersey, which is 2 towns over. So he was maybe 15 minutes away. So after spring training, the Yankees come home, and I drive over to Sparky's house. And Sparky had said to me, I'm going to take my tape recorder with me, and I will record what I, want to talk about. And I thought to myself, well, that's not going to work, but, that's what you want to do, fine. So I get over to Sparky's house, and he says, I guess we can't write a book. And I said, why not? He said, because I can't think of anything to say.
Oh.
Well,
wow.
So I said, Spark, I tell you what, I'll ask you questions. You answer my questions, and let's see what happens. So, of course, I had prepared about, 12 pages of questions for him. And we spent, a couple hours talking, and it was just, fabulously fabulous. And after, 4 or 5 of these sessions, I wrote a proposal, gave it to Jay Acton, who was my agent at the time. It's funny, I had another agent, but I said to her, I want to do this book with Sparky Lyle. And she said to me, who will want to read a book about a pinch pitcher? What she said. Apparently not a baseball fan, was she?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. No. Yeah.
But my editor of Dynasty, a guy named Frank Coffey, who's still a close friend of mine, lives out in California, he said to me, I've got an agent, Jay Acton. And Jay Acton loves baseball. Jay Acton was James Baldwin's agent. Acton was a pretty damn good agent at the time, and so he got us a contract for $40,000 to write this book. Now, Sparky at the time was making $140,000 a year, so he got 20 and I got 20. And back then, 20 was decent money.
Sure.
Part of the problem now is if a guy's making $10 million, you offer them $20,000, they can, they can do that in a weekend signing autographs.
Yeah,
makes it a lot harder. Yeah,
I imagine.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So Sparky and I, we spent the season, and what I didn't realize, of course, was that Sparky in '77 had been the Cy Young Award winner. He was a marvelous, marvelous relief pitcher. He had that great slider, and he helped lead the Yankees to the pennant and to the World Series.
Yep.
And so here we are in '78, and this is the year when Billy gets himself fired in the middle of the season for saying, well, one's a born liar and the other's convicted, meaning Reggie Jackson and George Steinbrenner.
Oh, yes.
And they bring in Bob Lemon, and they're 14 games behind the Red Sox in August, and they come back, and Bucky Dent hits a home run to put the Yankees into the World Series, and they beat the Dodgers in the World Series. And the other thing that made the Bronx Zoo so interesting was that Sparky was angry because after the '77 season, when he was a Cy Young Award winner, they brought in Goose Scotches and gave Goose Scotches $2 million. So
yeah,
bring this guy in,
gratitude.
give him $2 million. Sparky had been Cy Young Award winner, making $140,000, and it just didn't seem fair. And of course, it wasn't fair.
What more does a closer have to do, for
Right.
God's sake? I'm sure that was his attitude.
I'm sure. Well, but he was more than happy to talk about George Steinbrenner's sins and omissions. And that was the thing that really made the Bronx Zoo, because when the thing came out, Steinbrenner, who was very much like Donald Trump, the two of them, because they were twins.
Yep.
He went absolutely ballistic. Now, there was no tweeting back then, but he was able, obviously, to go on every single talk show and every news show imaginable and just, talk about Sparky in such a way that we sold 220,000 books. And it was quite amazing. It really was quite amazing.
And another richly entertaining book, and people can still buy it, can't they?
Yep. People can still buy it in every shape and form. You can buy it, I think, as an audio book. You can buy it as a paperback book. You can, you still can get it.
And the ebook, of course.
And an ebook.
Peter,
and an ebook.
We're just getting warmed up, and we're already to the end of our time. Peter Golenbock, my guest, prolific author, a lot of great baseball books, and a lot of other non-sports books as well. Peter, would you consider coming back next week for a part 2 of this program?
Yeah, sure. Why not?
Okay, thank you very much. I want to thank everybody for listening to Ask Claire, and until the next program, happy trails to you all.